Donald Trump announced that he will impose tariffs of 35% on Mexican imports and 45% on Chinese imports to protect American jobs from unfair foreign competition. The paper that we just reviewed evaluates potential trade wars between the states and China and the states and Mexico. The reading concludes that in global trade wars, all countries lose in terms of welfare. A trade war between a large country and a small one can result gains for the large country but losses for the small one, and a trade war cannot lead to gains for all countries involved. In cooperation may lead to a better solution for all countries. On the second section of the reading, Johnson analyzed the case of trade wars based on the optimum tariff argument and was the first to clearly demonstrate that large countries can benefit from a trade war whereas small countries always lose. Grossman and Helpman introduced domestic political agendas into the analysis of international relations with terms of trade externalities, under the assumption that national leaders are concerned not only with maximizing welfare but also with collecting campaign contributions from special interest groups. The third section talks about the U.S. trade relations with China and Mexico. The main reason for launching a trade war is the importance of bilateral with the United States trade deficits. And the fourth section talks about the methodology that is adopted to conduct the evaluation. First, the general features of MIRAGRODP, which is the CGE model adopted for this evaluation, then the data, and finally the scenario design and implementation. In its standard version, it's a recursive dynamic multi-region multi-sector model, but for the study, for the paper that we just reviewed, they use a static version of the model to optimize time and avoid specific theoretical issues regarding the implementation of a non-cooperative dynamic Nash game. The U.S. trade war with only Mexico starts with the tariffs, which first considered a potential trade war between the states and Mexico, and a 35% point increase in tariffs on all U.S. imports coming from Mexico as major terms of trade loss for Mexico, because earlier the reading explains that the United States receives more than 80% of Mexican exports, and if Mexico initiates retaliation, that is equivalent in terms of duty collected, it has to augment its tariffs on imports from the states by an extent slightly larger than the U.S. tariffs augmentation, which is normal because of the bilateral U.S. trade deficit with Mexico. The macroeconomic outcomes, these impacts are very close to the impacts on countries' GDP. In Mexico, important sectors in which value added is significantly hurt in all scenarios are motor vehicles and parts, transportation equipment, electronic equipment, and machinery and equipment. In the States, value added in all sectors and under all scenarios is not affected by more than 1% in absolute value, except in the case of the revenue retaliation scenario, which leads to substantial reprisals by Mexico. A U.S. trade with only China, so this imposition of a 35% point increase in import duties on Chinese products represent a severe loss of terms of trade for China, which has to impose a relatively high augmentation of import duties on U.S. products to reestablish its initial terms of trade. The reprisals are even more severe if the country's objective is to collect the same amount of duties the states has collected due to the trade flow from the states to China, which is much smaller than the trade flow from China to the States. So comparing Nash tariffs with other implemented in the hypothetical trade war, between these two. It's interesting to note that the Nash US tariffs augmentation against China is about 2 times smaller than the one imposed against Mexico. Many sectors in China are affected by this, in particular the electronic equipment sector, which represents 2.3% of total value added and is reduced in volume by 6.3%. A U.S. trade war between, with both Mexico and China. In all of these cases, in the reading, we consider that the U.S. government increases protection at the border on imports coming from China and Mexico. In cases with retaliation, we consider that China and Mexico augmented protection on imports coming from the States, but on the reading, we do not consider augmentation of Mexican tariffs on Chinese products or of Chinese tariffs on Mexican goods. So concerning the revenue retaliation scenarios, tariffs raised by both China and Mexico are quite similar to those raised in a bilateral trade war. This is normal because the collected duties are calculated on a baseline trade flow. In the TOT retaliation scenario, the tariffs raised by China and Mexico in the trilateral trade war are higher than the tariffs implemented in each bilateral trade war. In the welfare retaliation scenarios, the tariffs implemented by China and Mexico in either bilateral wars or dual bilateral wars is similar. So the first policy conclusion on the reading is that there is no scenarios under which the states benefits from either protectionism applied on these two trading partners or a trade war with them. The second conclusion comes from the observation that if we compare a trade war in which the states impose a 35% point increase in protection and the trading partner imposes a similar increase in import duties, both on a bilateral basis, with the Nash scenario in which both countries increase protection by a lesser extent, we see that countries' losses are significantly smaller in the second case. The third one concerns U.S. trading partners. Although China is significantly affected by trade wars, the welfare losses are potentially huge for us. The last one, the last conclusion underlines an economic mechanism in the model that softens the negative impact on China and Mexico, because the current account is supposed to be constant in percentage of GDP and adjustment of real exchanges rates through domestic prices is required. Fifth conclusion concerns the emergence of free riders, that is, countries, regions that benefit from a bilateral or trilateral trade war between the states and its trading partners. Trade wars are potentially harmful for the world economy. Protectionism is not the right way to reduce current account deficits from the private and public sectors, inasmuch as these deficits are mainly the consequence of insufficient savings.